certain categories related to dysfunctional urban growth. For example, reductions in open space for more sprawled urban development. And I'm now going to hand over to Anil, who's going to talk us a little bit through some of the findings from the more detailed case studies that we put together.
Thank you, Nick. This was a case where we went into greater depth in 4 cities. We did collect some primary data on the quality, the kinds of services which were provided to households and to firms for water, energy, water and sanitation, energy and transport. And the data was collected both on the quantity of services of different kinds, as well as a calculation of the cost, of full cost of these services, which included, of course, the direct costs, but also the indirect costs, including the health costs, environmental costs, social costs, such as costs of congestion, costs of accidents, and then the climate costs. So the figures show there gives you some details of the cost figures for the different areas. In transport, the reliance on private transport varies a lot, between 1 and 28% of transport in the 4 cities is provided by buses. Water, there's also quite a lot of difference. Between 2 and 40% of households are not supplied by public water utility. Sanitation, 38% of households not connected to a public sewer system. And for energy, it varies. The cooking fuels used by households often 29% of households lack access to LPG, and 80 to 95% lack kerosene. So the delivery is not insignificant. There's also a question of quality, and we try to make some estimates of the quality of the services. Details of that are given in the report. But the deficits in basic urban services then push households to undertake costly forms of self-provisioning. So when you look at the full costs, including the external costs and the other components of the social costs, you find many of the forms of self-provisioning to have much higher costs than the public or the public provisioning. So publicly coordinated services have a direct high cost, but in general they have a lower social cost than self-provision. The extent of public provision then does vary quite a lot across these 4 cities, and I think this is representative of cities in India as a whole. So for example, Pune and Surat have nearly 100% municipal water supply, while Indore has only 50% and Bangalore 77%. Sewerage connections vary from 67% in Indore to over 90% in Surat. The share of trips by bus range from only 1% in Surat to 28% in Bangalore. And this is interesting. There's virtually no use of diesel generation, which is quite environmentally costly for electricity in Pune and Surat, whereas around 16% of urban households use such sets on average across cities. So what we've done is worked in some detail with these cost figures, and the ongoing work looks at how these total costs will change between now and 2030, depending on which kind of development we undertake in terms of provision of infrastructure services. I think I'll leave it there. I think there's one more slide, I think, Nick, that you want to talk about.
Thank you. I mean, simply with this final slide, just to wrap up the discussion, which is, you know, in conclusion, related to the 5 core findings that we've just outlined. You know, this seems to suggest, and Nick, Isha, Niraj, and Nina have all mentioned that in different ways that clearly smart urbanisation should be a core part of economic development policy, and that proactive steps should be taken to overcome various barriers. And the report essentially highlights three key action areas. Reforming land use regulations to encourage more compact, connected urban growth. And there's a number of those which are mentioned in the report, and Nick mentioned some of the existing land use regulations absolutely work against the grain of promoting more compact, connected urban growth. Second, expanding urban infrastructure is clearly critical, and Niraj Mandloy mentioned some significant existing government programs that are already being set up and galvanized behind this agenda, such as the Smart Cities program. And so the report really encourages those programs to scale up and enhance their ambition. And then thirdly, and Isha mentioned this very well, which was the point around reforming local urban government and how important that is as a prerequisite for financing flowing. So the report talks about some of those measures in terms of that could be taken to strengthen urban governance, but also makes very clear the point around enhancing domestic revenue bases is absolutely critical, and Nick Stern made this point very, very well in his opening remarks. So I will leave it there. There's much more detail in the report itself, but I hope we've given a good overview of the key findings, and just want to thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Juan. Thank you very much. Thanks, Nick and Anil. So I just want to have this opportunity here from us to discuss, and Smith, I want you to go first, and then we.
Thank you very much. I have to say I've had the pleasure of reviewing the interim versions of some of these reports, so it really is a pleasure to see them released today. And I would strongly encourage those of you who have not had a chance to read them to read them. This is sort of a set of reports and whose, which deserves not only more attention, but I think the folks at the table haven't done as much to toot the horn of these reports. So let me do a little bit of that. My comments really are going to be focused on urbanization within the context of India's industrial transformation. And I'm going to lay out a series of remarks. But in that context, let me say that these reports break three grounds. They break ground in three areas. One is that it uses unconventional data. It's bold to use unconventional data, and it goes after them to combine them in innovative ways. Lots of reports, it is true that a lot of reports have come out on urbanization, but they don't all do this. The second is that slightly unconventional urban comparisons are made. And you might argue, if you were going to be nitpicky, that some of those comparisons aren't quite what you would call rigorous. But if we kept doing the same old, you wouldn't have the insights that have come out of this study. And I would say, therefore, quite bold in the kind of comparisons made. And the third, of course, is it raises both the studies and some of the others that will come out, raise some very interesting questions about economic growth and spatialization. And I'm going to be very, very motivated in 2 weeks at the UN Economic Commission of Africa reviews to be suggesting to them that they look very systematically at these reports, because I think the impact is quite far-reaching. What I do want to say is that perhaps these reports, and I've said this before in a previous review, but to this audience maybe frame it a little bit differently. If we had to connect these reports to a next phase and think about what we would do in terms of situating India's urbanization, I would say we actually have the facts historically with us. We know instinctively, historically across many continents, that cities have meant jobs. People come to work in cities. We know also that a lot of infrastructure gets put down when cities grow quickly, but usually not fast enough. We also know that things like transportation and energy become quite critical. You can go back in time and you can think about where factories were located, you can think about trucking, you can think about energy sources near rivers. All of this were historical facts about cities. I think what these reports are reminding us about is the fact that those convergences don't automatically happen. And this is where the question of policy and planning really come in. After a certain point and a certain scale of growth, you don't see these things automatically converge. They might happen for small towns, they may well happen for certain kinds of resource networks, but they don't automatically happen. And if we actually think of India's very specific industrial transformation, I would say that there's some quite open questions that these reports and these papers actually leave us with. One is, if we imagine that cities are somewhere in the transition of industrial development, but we don't quite know where that urbanization process sits, Indian data actually leaves us some questions. It leaves us some very open questions. We have tended to think of a quite tedious transformation between agriculture to manufacturing and services. I think it's fair to say that Indian urban data actually complicates this story quite substantially. And think of my home state, Karnataka. If I had to say industrial development, the reality is that cities have industrialized quite differently. You can think of Davangere, you can think of Hubli Dharwad, you can think of Mangalore, you can think of Bangalore. They're all different patterns of industrial development. So in India, when we say use shorthand and we discuss industrial development, what actually is happening are very different patterns of industrializing urbanization. And I think this is quite reflected in both the reports in two particular ways. One is that there's an opportunity cost for the resources in these different patterns of industrial urbanization. Firms use up these resources in particular ways, households fight for these resources in particular ways. And I think some of the costing studies done by Professor Markandya and so on are very provocative, because what they do is they position the cost of these resources in a broader context. And we can see across these four cities, which have very different patterns of economic development, that the opportunity cost for these resources start showing up at the level of households. And the other piece of this is that when we start thinking of these transitions, we automatically must imagine that the relationship of cities is, of course, to urbanization as a process. The levers for us to change the pattern of cities may not exist within cities. They may exist within regional networks. They may exist at the level of higher levels of governance. Cities themselves may not have all the attributes to actually make the transformation that we are aspiring to here. I think one of the other provocations in this study, which have not actually come out as much and perhaps could lead into a second phase, the two reports really speak to each other. They're talking about the issue of the cost of services and of poverty, particularly low-income households. And the question is, how does that connect to the question of productivity and growth? I think this is an open question. We have tended to do this with a variety of policy instruments in India. I think the studies open up a question: how does poverty connect to the questions of productivity that we seek on the growth side? And what instruments would we mediate? I will just put across two sorts of very different historical formats of this. One, of course, was a South Korean case where growth happened, a lot of other things happened, and then there was a lot of patchwork later, not just to even out the regional development story, but also to address some of these questions of poverty. The Nordic cases are other cases of a very different kind of relationship between cities and industrial transformation and productivity. If we think of cities, therefore, as part of a larger urbanization pattern, Indian cities and their policy discourse, we all know, are quite different. We don't have mayors, we don't have the same kinds of figureheads that could perhaps leverage this kind of political transition. And I think we really have to think about what this would look like for India. And all of us in this room have experiences where we know that something is not moving because the